This is a double-linked identification. Mom in the box and the Monterey Jane Doe, identified as Linda Ray Jacobs and Adah Florence Jacobs. This story starts out in Monterey, California, in February of 2014. It was then that the police received a call to the 1100 block of 4th Street. They would tentatively identify her thanks to the California state driver's license that she was carrying, stating her name was Francesca Linda Jacobs, listing her birth date as 1955. It was determined the COD was starvation. They stated that no foul play was suspected at all. But then as they began digging into this case, they realized that inside of a box in her house, under her kitchen table, was the remains of somebody else. The woman was fully clothed, and she'd clearly been inside that box for years. No COD could even be determined, so of course foul play couldn't be ruled out. And obviously it's not normal to keep a person in a box under your table. Hence the nickname, in her case, as Mom in the Box. Questions began to arise involving Francesca Jacobs. So according to her driver's license, she was 58, but she appeared to be far older than that age. So they started to trace her life, and they would determine that there's almost no records at all of her living it. They knew she lived in the Monterey Peninsula dating back to about the 1990s. They would try to find proof of her, and it was more important than just figuring out who she was. They were trying to figure out who the woman in the box was. Every step they took just raised more questions. It was one of those mysteries that only DNA can answer. So then, of course, enter Othram Labs. In this case, the expensive testing that was needed was covered by Roads to Justice, and they would fund this. As they began sifting through matches, they were led to the former husband of our Jane Doe. He would let them know while her name was not actually Francesca Jacobs, it was pretty close. The woman was in fact Linda Ray Jacobs. Now remember, she said she was born in 1955 but looks older. And it would turn out that she had shaved 13 years off her age. She was actually born in 1942. The DNA would also match hers, so the mom in the box was actually her mother, and they would determine her name was Adah Florence Jacobs. Adah and Linda were actually a really close mother and daughter team for a very long time, and no one really knows how it all fell apart or what led to her using a false name, or why she chose to keep her mother where she was. The entire story is pretty bizarre. Linda Jacobs had a difficult life. She fell in her carport, breaking her leg, and found herself laying there in pain for quite a while. And in that instance, her calls for help weren't heard by anybody. Eventually she was found, and some people around the community would try to help her. A neighborhood boy would take her garbage out once a week. Unfortunately, she had no insurance, and she felt she couldn't get medical help. As a result, her health began to decline. She found herself suffering in silence, home alone, unable to work or make any sort of money. She was considered a little bit of a cranky neighbor. As a result, people weren't particularly falling over themselves to help her, which made it harder, and likely made her crankier, which is pretty understandable. She had to be feeling pretty desperate at the time. So she would eventually find herself living alone in the apartment she'd lived in for 12 years, with only her cats for company. Her landlord would try to get in to check out the house, and she wouldn't let him in. If anything in her home broke, her landlord would have to just leave the part at the door, and she would fix it herself. She allowed nobody past the threshold of her doorway. We know, though, that before all of this happened, Linda was actually a pretty prominent real estate agent, and she had worked her way up and was selling pretty high-end homes. One of those people she sold a home to was the landlord of the apartment she was living in. As her health declined, she had to stop selling homes. By 2002, she wasn't working anymore at all. It didn't help that during this time, a friend would say that she fell down and hurt her shoulder also, in addition to breaking her leg. Between the two accidents, she was in constant pain, and that probably lent itself to part of why she had what was considered a grouchy personality. Money was tight, and her circumstances were pretty sad. A neighborhood teen would bring her fountain drinks, which was her only luxury. It appears she was emaciated and weak already by this time, but she didn't ask anyone for help, other than that plea for fountain drinks. After accepting the final fountain drink that the neighbor brought her, she didn't even shut the door. She apparently stumbled back, landing on her couch one final time. She was found after a day, and that was because a welfare check was called in by one of the neighbors because the door had stayed open. Likely no one went in themselves because she didn't allow anyone in her house. What was found was described as a disturbing scene. She was wearing a velour pantsuit with glasses full of urine all over the house. The house itself was described as a hoarding situation. More about this is described in an article I found about this case, and it's linked below. You can see her apartment here as it appears on Zillow. She had a 2-bedroom, 600 square foot apartment, so it was pretty small with one bathroom. And then, of course, it leaves us to Adah, who was found inside the box. Her remains were described as mummified. They had been wrapped in plastic and placed inside of a wooden crate that was wrapped again in plastic, and then hidden inside of a cardboard box. She had likely been in that box for at least 20 years. It does not say if she was collecting Social Security for her mother. That would probably explain it, but that isn't mentioned here at all, which makes me think that probably wasn't the case. The strange thing didn't stop there. She had no pots and pans or any dishes at all. In fact, she had no food at all in her kitchen, not even a can. The refrigerator and freezer were completely empty. She had a coffee maker, but it hadn't been used in a long time. A neighbor of hers would not only bring her fountain pot, but would sometimes bring her enchiladas or pasta, and it appears that was all that she'd been eating. Linda was pretty ready for her own demise. She had removed the few photos that she had and wrapped them in plastic. She had one purse that had an ID card in it, identifying her under that fake name. She had included a handwritten poem that was titled Safely Home and was about being at home in heaven. She had a handwritten will and gave all of her property to her landlord. By this time, her rent was months behind, and she left jewelry items to cover that cost. She also had left a note saying that her mother, Florence Adah Jacobs, was in the dining room, but it didn't say why. Terry, who was a neighbor who had been the one giving her leftover food sometimes and bringing her fountain drinks, would say that she was able to share that Linda had a pain medication problem, but also a love of her cats, and had been feeding a cat that had been found in the complex that everybody had named Pest. Linda had told Terry that Pest had saved her life when he showed up because she was ready to pass away, and he gave her a renewed desire to live. Linda would take her walker outside and go on short walks with the cat. But then Pest got sick and passed away, and it was at this point that Linda's physical and mental health began to decline more and more. Terry would say that she always believed that Linda had money, and it appeared Linda had been selling off a lot of jewelry and items. But of course we know she had items left because she left them to her landlord. But no one knows for sure why she had a fake name. She had been working, and normally one could apply for SSDI, if unable to work, of course. But because she was so committed to the fake name, I guess, and her work history, I'm not sure how that worked. She had to have given some sort of a social security number. So while it's all strange, they found out that Linda had been married at one point, and she had been living with her mother and her husband in Monterey. But she eventually divorced him, and he would take to walking past her home with his new significant other, apparently angry that she was still in the home that they used to share together. She would describe this as being mentally abusive and causing her to break down, sharing that information with her landlord. Her landlord noted that at one point, if anyone brought up her mother, she would get very angry, so nobody really knew what happened to Adah. As Linda's health declined, she would call her landlord at all times of the day or night, constantly worried about her health. This is generally considered to fit into OCD, as would the hoarding of urine in cups or hoarding of other items. Linda also began having panic attacks. Her landlord was really kind and understanding. She even gave her $4,000 at one point to help out with bills. It ran out eventually, obviously, but Linda didn't ask her for any more help. And in fact, at some point, her landlord offered to help more, but Linda declined. In the end, Linda only weighed 65 pounds when she was found. The question of why her mom was in that box has never been solved. The police would say there's no indication that Linda hurt her mother, and it's possible that she was a sad, lonely woman who kept her mother there because she wanted her near. Linda and Adah Jacobs went unidentified for 9 years. Had Linda lived, she would be 81 years old today. The Grand Bay Jane Doe identified as Adah Elizabeth Fritz. Some kids were fishing in a creek underneath Potter Tract Road, which is south of Grand Bay, Alabama. One of the kids would comment about it as an adult, saying his friend stopped by and wanted to go fishing, so they went down to the same area of the creek that they always did. They would see what they thought was garbage, saying it had been thrown over the bridge, and like normal curious boys, they found themselves prodding at it with sticks, trying to figure out what it was. At this point, they would see a limb, but at this time, like many people before them, they would think it was a mannequin. And as a wise commenter said in one of my videos, it's never actually a mannequin. Some of these poor boys realized that they dragged the contents out of the creek and that it was a real person, saying they got the heck out of there and ran to their parents the moment they realized that this was something serious. One of those boys would speak out later on, saying he was 14 and it still freaks him out. And at the time, he couldn't sleep alone or with the lights off. I think it's easy to forget that in a lot of these cases, younger people find the remains. In their own way, they're an additional victim of whatever happened. The police would say that it was clear the perpetrator did everything they could to keep her from being identified. Her hands had been removed, as had her dentures. There was a plastic bag on her head and her arms. They believed that she'd been transported to where she was dumped, and this was done to try to keep trace evidence out of the car. She was the victim of a gunshot taken there in a car and not a truck. They believed she was between 50 and 65, and the police would comment that it was shocking, saying she was probably someone's mother or grandmother, that it's not an age they expect to run into, and that it was especially surprising when no one came forward to identify her. Nearly 20 years would pass before there was any sort of a break. At this time, a woman was found in the pond near the Alabama-Mississippi line. It would mimic our Jane Doe's scene. Her dentures and hands had been removed, and in that case, they caught who was responsible. I wish I had a photo of Irma to show, as she deserves recognition too, but all I know is that Irma Williams had her life taken in Moss Point, Mississippi, and it was determined that the person who did this was her own son, a shipyard worker named Henderson James Williams. I barely found a photo of the son. Henderson Williams definitely deserves to spend the rest of his life in prison. He would go on and refuse to address his link to the other unidentified Jane Doe, and he passed away in prison without ever saying what happened or identifying the other woman. What seems sort of bizarre to me too is he was never going to get out. That was determined by his sentence, and still he couldn't even find it in himself to give this woman back her name and explain what happened. But they do believe he's the one who did this. He lived 20 years after our Jane Doe passed before taking his mother's life. He was convicted in 1996, and he would go on to live 12 years in prison before passing away there, meaning that he spent 32 years on Earth after our Jane Doe's life was taken. But it's just amazing how someone could live with that and not even try to do right in the end. But he was definitely not a good guy. His mother was 94 years old when he took her life, and he reportedly did it because he wanted access to her bank account and she had refused. He apparently wanted her Social Security checks. The biggest issue in identifying our own decedent here is the fact that they cremated her. Thankfully, in most of the cases, this was not done, but they had no idea then that DNA would actually provide answers later on. So sadly, some of these people lost their chance to be identified. But there was a little bit of a twist here. The police would at one point declare at the end of the road, saying any work needed DNA, and that's lost with cremation. There were no dentals because she had no teeth. They didn't have fingerprints because they had no hands. But then something pretty amazing happened. The officer was looking into the cold case, made a discovery that he thought out of the box with. Investigators in 1976 had actually made a cast of our Jane Doe's mouth, and they had kept it in a box. Even though they didn't have her dentures, they'd hoped that that cast might make a difference at some point. And it did, just not in the way that they expected. Moxie Forensics was able to take that cast of her mouth and isolate usable DNA. So huge props to Detective Thornton in Grand Bay, Alabama, for thinking outside of the box, as well as to Moxie Forensics for many of the identifications that just happened. Investigator Thornton told the press that they needed some kind of physical evidence to tie him to her crime, and that was impossible, due to what he described as the lapse of time and the government's inability to maintain records for extended periods, which makes me think he was pretty frustrated also. He would say that he didn't think they'd get usable DNA, but he was so excited to the possibility, saying it was all meant to be, and he was thankful that his pessimism went unrewarded. They would call it a scientific miracle. The DNA would eventually lead to a cousin that was pretty far down the line, going back 7 generations. But unlike a lot of the stories where this happens, that cousin was described as knowing people. She was able to track down one of her nephews who had a photograph that would eventually be used to help identify this person. Obviously, as time goes by, a lot of the living people that could identify him also pass. So it gets really hard to make the identification. So this was pretty miraculous in its own way, how all of this went. This nephew would mention that his aunt, Adah Elizabeth Fritz, was 61 in 1976 when she went missing. He would say that she went missing from Batesville, Arkansas. Batesville is about 519 miles, or 836 kilometers, away from where she was found, in Grand Bay, Alabama, which back then was an entirely different world when it came to making identifications. So it might as well have been halfway across the United States. He would say that Adah Fritz lived for many years in Oregon, and she would marry twice. Her last husband was pretty abusive to her, and she chose to leave the area when she finally got away from him, traveling to the Gulf Coast for a fishing trip. It's suspected that it was at this time that Adah came across Henderson Williams. By this point, Williams was already long known to be a pretty bad guy, too. Had the system looked out for those around Williams, his mother and Adah would have most likely lived naturally long lives. Because it turns out that in 1973, Williams was convicted of his first of the 3 lives we believe he took. It's not clear why he was let out, but he served only 28 days in that case, after a conviction in Newport News, Virginia. We also know now that one of Adah's friends actually suspected that she was the Jane Doe. This woman was named Frannie Mae Gaunt, and her name appears inside of the notes on Adah's case. She came forward saying she thought that the Jane Doe was her friend Adah. It's unclear why they never followed up or tried to confirm this. In a sad twist of fate, Frannie Mae Gaunt herself became a victim of someone else, her life being taken only 2 years later. And in her case, it's still cold and unsolved. We know now that Adah was born in Sheridan, Wyoming in 1914. And in the case of Adah, he went to a lot of effort to wipe her identity away, and he won. And that always seems pretty unforgivable. Her nephew, who is now in his 70s, would say that the aunt who'd been so kind to him as a child had needed to get away and start over. And he knows for sure that 48 days before her remains were found, she had been living in Batesville, Arkansas. She had barely moved there right before this happened. When he was young, he used to spend his summers with his Aunt Adah. They even went hunting together. Adah Elizabeth Fritz was born 109 years ago, and she was a Jane Doe for 47 years. The Elgen Jane Doe, identified as Kathy Ann Smith. This story starts in Elgin, Texas in 1979. The photo here shows a woman found buried in a cemetery, but it wasn't an official burial. Obviously, those who found her knew she shouldn't have been buried there, but that's obviously only one piece of the puzzle. They knew the person was female and that she was in her mid-teens to 40s, which obviously is not super helpful. They knew she had a slight build, maybe 5 to 5'2", or 152 to 157 centimeters. She was wearing a shirt that said Evian JRS and some blue jeans. They couldn't even pinpoint her COD. Over the years, they tried to promote this case, hoping to find another piece to the puzzle that might help solve it finally. One suggestion was that Henry Lee Lucas was to blame. I know he took blame for a whole lot of things that he didn't do, or should I say took credit. But in this one, she was found nearby to an actual victim that he was found guilty for. So that does lend a little bit of credibility to it. He would, of course, take credit, but as I've been open with before, not very believable. But in this case, he would say that she helped him take her own life. But all that said, this particular monster was a consistent liar. Although in this case, he's labeled as a primary suspect, so I feel like I have to say something. Lucas's MO was finding someone off the side of the road and hitting them with his car. As technology progressed and more opportunities for law enforcement began, they would start reopening a lot of the cases that previously were thought would never be closed. And this was one of those. In 2019, they started from the beginning again and they examined her. Although in this one, they did say that she probably had been hit by a car, but it can't be confirmed. So perhaps that's again another possible for Henry Lee Lucas, since that does fit in with his MO. He claimed a lot, and he's believed to be responsible for just a tiny bit for what he's confessed to. They developed a theory that she'd been hit by a car on the Texas Highway 95 between Bastrop and Elgin in Texas, and that whoever did this buried her. In 2019, they would process her DNA and submit it to CODIS. And this is, of course, the system that's linked in with NamUs, which is the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. But once it was in there, it led nowhere. But the only way it would ever link to someone is if someone committed a crime in her family, or if somebody from her family submitted their DNA in hopes of getting a match because she'd been missing for a long time. So unfortunately, matches don't often happen this way. That's why they end up having to resort to genetic genealogy. So in 2022, they decided to exhume her once again and do the more expensive route of redoing her DNA for genetic genealogy. And for this, they enlisted Othram Labs. This was funded through DNA Solves, which is the funding arm of Othram, and Project Grace also helped provide funds. Tracing her genealogy was really difficult in this case, as it was with any Jane Doe who'd been adopted. We now know that her name was Kathy Ann Smith, born July 19, 1956, and in fact, she was only 22 when her life was taken. It was really amazing work on their part because Kathy Ann Smith is her adopted name. We know now also that she was not adopted as a baby, but instead was a little bit older than that. And as a result of this genetic genealogy search, now both families know what happened to their loved one. I wish so much I could tell you more about who Kathy was, but the truth is that I don't know. If I find out anything in the meantime, I'll show it on the screen as an editor's note. She was a 22-year-old mother who was just starting out in her life. That child is likely around 44 now, living more than double the life her mother did before the truth came out as to what happened to Kathy. The police are asking that someone come forward with information. Please call the number on the screen if you have any information at all on this case. Kathy Ann Smith went unidentified for 44 years. Had she lived, she would be 68 years old today. The Willcox John Doe, also known as the Pima County John Doe, identified as Joseph Meyers Sr. There was an accident on March 11, 1992, in Willcox, Arizona. He was accidentally hit by a train. It doesn't appear that it was an intentional act, but was rather some sort of accident. This one is a little bit unusual because his fingerprints linked to his name, or at least the name that they believed was his. But no next of kin was located at all, and so they couldn't confirm it. And obviously sometimes when people are arrested, they try to give different names. It's harder to get away with it now because they can digitally check, but in 1992 that obviously wasn't the case. So for this reason, they weren't sure if this was even his real name. Thanks to Moxie Forensics, his identity was found, and we now know his name is in fact Joseph William Meyers Sr., and he was from Texas. His family had no idea he was even in Arizona. It's possible that the 35-year-old man was trying to hop on a train, like many before him. They used to call it riding the rails. Maybe they still do, but it's a lot harder to get on the trains now. And even if they do, it's very dangerous. For a long time, they were able to get on, and a lot of the cars weren't locked. But in many cases, if they are locked, they'll be stuck right in that spot trying to hang on. And of course, the train is going fast. And falling off the train has, of course, led to a number of John Does that I've covered. Joseph Meyers Sr. went unidentified for 31 years. Had he lived, he would be 66 years old today. The Pima County Jane Doe, also known as the Tucson John Doe, 1999, identified as Maria Valdez-Morones. There's not a lot available on this case, but the person who did this to her is still out there. So for that reason, I really wanted to cover it. A woman was found on May of 1999 behind a store dumpster. although it's not clear what store that even was. We do know this was in Tucson, Arizona. Even her COD isn't listed in this case. It does say that foul play isn't suspected, and no one's even been questioned in this case. Now, I could be really off base, but something really bothers me in this statement and doesn't seem right. Let me know what you guys think. We know now that she wasn't here legally, that she had gone missing from Sonora, Mexico, which is basically very close to Tucson, on the other side of the border. But it's not every day that a 26-year-old female passes away naturally, either did so behind a dumpster, or someone drug her behind the dumpster because why? It doesn't make any sense to me. I know I should probably reserve judgment without more information. Someone could drag someone who died of natural causes behind a dumpster, but I don't know, it seems very odd. Maria's case was solved by Moxie Forensics, who I think solved about 4 or 5 in this group that I'm recording here now. That's quite a bit all of a sudden. The more places doing the identifications, the better. If anyone has any information, please call the number on the screen. Maria went unidentified for 24 years. Had she lived, she would be 50 years old today. The Ashland City Jane Doe, also known as the Cheatham County Jane Doe, identified as Linda Sue Karnes. It was on October 21, 1981, in Ashland City, Tennessee, when skeletal remains were found in Cheatham County. This was in the county landfill off of Highway 249 near Ashland. The woman was believed to be mid-teens to 20 years old, though they estimated it a little lower at one point. The examining anthropologist agreed she was younger. Recreations were made as to what she might have looked like, and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation pushed hard to try to find her identity, eventually imploring the public to look at the recreations and come forward with information. Like a lot of these cases, they submitted to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification, who then uploads to CODIS. They did so, and also, like a lot of these cases, no CODIS hits ever happened. So, unfortunately, this means back to the DNA drawing board, where they need to get a sample suitable for genetic genealogy. And for this, Othram Labs was enlisted to help. This would eventually lead to potential family members in Tennessee and Florida. Once approached, those family members were able to share that a member of their family was known to be missing for more than 4 decades. Eventually, they were able to confirm that this was, in fact, Linda Sue Karnes, who was born in August of 1964 in Cleveland, Ohio, although for the most part she'd grown up in Cunningham, Tennessee. She was living in Clarksville when she disappeared. Clarksville and Ashland City, where she was found, are just 30 miles or 48 kilometers away from each other. So she was found relatively close by. She was living in a group home and she ran away. There's no indication why she was there. It's possible she got into some sort of legal trouble, but also at an older age, it's hard to place teens in foster homes too. I can't help but feel like the system failed her. She was close by and the postmortem interval was only 3 to 9 months, and they still didn't match her. Her COD was the result of a gunshot. Perhaps, had they matched her up, someone in the group home or a social worker might have had information that might have led to the perpetrator. That's the hard part too. It's not just about their name. They need someone to come forward to try to make whoever did this pay. No one deserves to end up in a landfill. Linda Sue Karnes has gone unidentified for 41 years. Had she lived the life she deserved, she would be 59 years old today. The penned Orielle County John Doe, identified as Randall Reed Priborsky. This is a video I covered before, and I'm going to run it now and then do an update. It's a short video, not even 2 minutes, but it explains how he was found. Penned Orielle County John Doe, penned Orielle County, Washington. A man was found in December of 2014 in a remote wooded area of Washington state, inside of a tent. If they know what happened, it wasn't released, so it was likely natural. He had on a blue JanSport backpack, a red sleeping bag. He had some toothpaste, nail clippers, deodorant, just general items of self-care. He had a thick blue and red watch cap and aviator glasses. He wore a size 3XL, a plaid button-up Faded Glory t-shirt, and pants that were sized 48 by 30. He had on military-style boots with a steel toe in a size 8. They described his face as being asymmetrical, saying there were other signs of health abnormalities that may have caused discomfort, although it's not listed as exactly what that meant. Even his age isn't very clear. He is listed as age pre-70, which would mean he was born essentially in 1945 or sooner. It appears his hair color is also unknown. The penned Orielle County John Doe has gone unidentified for 8 years. Thanks to Othram Labs, we finally know his name is Randall Reed Korski, and we now know that he hadn't contacted his family since 2003, but he was last seen in 2008. His remains were found in 2014. Randall's father was a widower, and he had remarried Randall's stepmom years earlier. His father, Robert, passed away in 1998 at the age of 73. His father's obituary lists Randall as living in Mesa, Arizona at the time. By 2000, when his stepmother passed, he was living in Sioux City, Iowa. However, he ended up in a tent in Washington, and we don't know why. His last known sighting was in Old Town, Ohio. Randall had 2 brothers. One brother, Ray, would himself pass just 10 days after Randall's identification was announced on August 7, 2023. Raymond's obituary is shown here. He lists the date of death for Randall as 2009. What's so sad about this is people so easily pass themselves without knowing what happened to the person they've been searching for. I hope for the one remaining brother, this provides at least a small amount of peace. His exact age isn't given, so I'm not even sure how old he would be today. Randall likely passed away 14 years ago, and he went unidentified for 9 years. Huge thanks for watching all the way to the end, and a big thanks to all of you who consistently like and comment on the videos. The whole dance with YouTube is hard sometimes. Whether you leave a full comment or an emoji, it makes a huge difference. It's a huge push toward the videos being suggested to new people. The next goal is 20,000. Thanks everyone for watching. Take care of yourselves and each other.